He didn't just leave her, he tried to erase her. In front of the city's elite, Julian Vance held up his new fiancée like a trophy, a flawless glittering prize, while casting his ex-wife, Isabella, aside like a forgotten relic. He boasted about his upgrade, his brilliant future, his fiancée's perfect beauty, believing Isabella was nothing without him, a ghost at the feast of her own life. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He assumed she was weeping in the shadows. He never imagined that while he was busy showing off a diamond, she had quietly accepted a diamond mine. What happens when a man's ego writes a check his reality can't cash? Stay with us. The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was the annual Starlight Foundation Gala, a night where New York City's financial titans and social royalty gathered to outbid, outdress, and outshine one another under the guise of philanthropy. For Isabella Rossi, it was the first time she'd attended a major social event alone since her divorce from Julian Vance. She had built a name for herself, her art gallery becoming a respected space for emerging artists, but in these circles, she was still, and perhaps forever would be, Julian Vance's ex-wife. She saw him across the room, a shark, in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, and on his arm was Aria Sterling. Aria was, Isabella had to admit, breathtaking. A decade younger, with hair the color of spun gold, and a smile that had been expertly calibrated for maximum charm and camera appeal. She was an Instagram model turned lifestyle influencer, a career that seemed to consist of being beautiful in expensive locations. Isabella was nursing a glass of champagne, speaking with an elderly board member about a potential art endowment when she felt a sudden shift in the room's energy. Julian had taken the stage. It wasn't on the program, but a hefty last-minute donation had a way of creating new agenda items. "Good evening, everyone." Julian's voice boomed smooth and confident. He flashed a smile that had closed billion-dollar deals and once upon a time captured her heart. "I just wanted to take a moment on this night of giving to speak about new beginnings, about finding true value." A ripple of polite applause. Isabella felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She knew this tone. This was Julian's "I'm the king of the world" voice. "As many of you know," he continued, gesturing for Aria to join him on the stage, "the last year has been one of transition for me, but it has also been one of incredible discovery." He wrapped his arm around Aria's impossibly small waist, pulling her close. The light from the chandeliers caught the enormous canary diamond on her left hand, sending a spray of yellow fire across the faces in the front row. "I discovered what it means to be with someone who truly inspires, someone whose beauty inside and out is an asset in itself." He beamed at Aria, who blushed demurely. "When you're aiming for the top, you need a partner who looks the part, someone who shines, someone flawless." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. Isabella remembered the nights she'd stayed up late, helping him prep for presentations, proofreading his reports, using her art history degree to help him connect with eccentric art-loving investors. She remembered sacrificing a trip to see her ailing grandmother because he had a critical networking event. He called her his secret weapon back then. Now, in front of a room of their former friends and colleagues, now he was recasting her as a liability, a flawed prototype he'd had to discard. A man at a nearby table, a hedge fund manager named Marcus Thorne, who had been a groomsman at their wedding, leaned over to his wife and whispered not quite quietly enough, "That's a brutal shot at Isabella." Ouch! Isabella stood, frozen, her champagne flute feeling heavy in her hand. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes darting between her and the radiant couple on stage. Some were pitying, others morbidly curious. It was a social execution, and she was the guest of honor. "So I'd like to propose a toast," Julian announced, raising his glass. "To my magnificent fiancée, Aria. Thank you for showing me what a perfect 10 really looks like. To a future that is as bright and beautiful as you are." The room erupted in applause, a mixture of genuine enthusiasm for the spectacle and nervous energy. Julian's gaze swept the room, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met Isabella's. There was no remorse in them, only a cold, triumphant glint. He was making a point. "I won. You lost." Isabella didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, the bubbles tasting like ash in her mouth. When the toast was done, she placed the glass on a passing waiter's tray, turned with a poise she didn't feel, and walked out of the ballroom, her head held high. The clicking of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound she allowed herself to make. She didn't hear the whispers that followed her, the post-mortems of her public humiliation. She only focused on the cool night air that would meet her outside, a welcome balm to the burning shame that licked at her cheeks. The ride back to her Upper West Side brownstone was a blur. Isabella stared out at the glittering lights of Manhattan, each one a pinprick in the dark fabric of her composure. The driver, a kind man named Hector she'd used for years, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern, but said nothing. He had driven her and Julian to countless events just like this one. He knew. She didn't cry. The humiliation was too sharp, too cold for tears. It felt like a shard of ice lodged in her chest. Julian hadn't just insulted her, he had retroactively devalued their entire life together. He had reframed 12 years of partnership as a business arrangement, where she had failed to meet the aesthetic qualifications. Flawless, the word echoed in her mind. He wanted perfection, a doll, to accessorize his ambition. She had been a person with thoughts, dreams, and the occasional stress wrinkle. Her flaw was her humanity. Once inside her home, the silence was a welcome embrace. The space was entirely her own, filled with art that spoke to her books she loved, and a sense of peace Julian's restless energy had always shattered. She sank onto a velvet sofa, the adrenaline of her dignified escape finally ebbing away, leaving a profound weariness in its wake. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from her best friend Sarah. "I just heard what he did. That man is a monster. Are you okay? I'm coming over." Isabella smiled, faintly grateful for the fierce loyalty. "I'm okay. Honestly, don't worry. Let's get lunch tomorrow. I have something to tell you." She put the phone down, and her gaze fell upon a framed photo on the mantelpiece, one she kept turned away from the room. She picked it up. It wasn't of her and Julian. It was a candid shot taken a few weeks ago in a small, sun-drenched cafe in Florence. In it, she was laughing, head thrown back, a splash of gelato on her nose. The man sitting across from her was looking at her, not the camera, and the expression on his face was one of such profound, unguarded affection that it made her heart ache in the best possible way. Damian Blackwood. The name was an earthquake in the worlds of tech and finance, yet he was a ghost in the society pages. He was a notorious recluse, the architect of a software empire who valued his privacy above all else. They had met 6 months ago, not at a gala, but at her gallery. He'd come in on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, drenched and without an entourage, to quietly look at a new exhibition. He wasn't just looking at the price tags, he was seeing the art. They spoke for 2 hours about the brushstrokes of a particular piece, the artist's intent, the emotion it evoked. He didn't know who her ex-husband was, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like Isabella formerly Vance. She was just Isabella. Their relationship had blossomed away from the prying eyes of the world, a secret garden she had nurtured with a fierce protectiveness. It was real and quiet and deep. It was everything her marriage to Julian wasn't. Damien loved her for her mind, her passion, her laugh lines. He called the small scar above her eyebrow a souvenir from a childhood bicycle accident, the accent mark on his favorite word. He hadn't been at the gala tonight because he despised such events, calling them peacock parades. He was in London, closing a deal that would dwarf anything Julian had ever touched. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was him. No text, just a FaceTime call. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and answered, forcing a smile. There she is. Damien's voice was a low, warm rumble that settled her frayed nerves instantly. He was in a hotel room, looking tired, but happy. I was worried you'd be asleep. How was the peacock parade? It was as expected, she said, her voice even. Lots of feathers. He studied her face, his perception unnervingly sharp. You're wearing your armor. What happened, Izzy? She hesitated, then the dam broke. The words tumbled out not in a torrent of anger, but in a flat, tired recitation of Julian's speech, the toast, the canary diamond, the collective stare of the room. Damien listened without interruption, his expression hardening from concern to a still cold fury. When she finished, there was a long silence. That man, Damien said, finally, his voice dangerously quiet, is a fool. A loud, insecure, and spectacularly cruel fool. He paused. Are you all right, my love? Truly. I am now, she whispered, and it was the truth. Saying it all out loud to him had put it in perspective. Julian was a noisy child, banging a drum for attention. Damien was the quiet king who owned the kingdom. He makes me feel like I wasted so much of my life. Never, Damien said fiercely. You built a life. He just happened to be in it. He didn't make you who you are, Isabella. Now I have a question for you, and it has nothing to do with him. He shifted the camera. On the table beside him was a simple, elegant black velvet box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on the dark silk, was a ring. It wasn't a garish boulder like Aria's. It was a sapphire, the color of a twilight sky, cut in a classic, elegant emerald shape and flanked by 2 subtle, perfectly matched diamonds. It was a ring that whispered it didn't scream. It was timeless, just like the art he loved. I was going to do this in Florence next month, he said, his voice softening. In the cafe where we first felt like us. But I think now is a better time. I don't want you to have one more night where you feel devalued. Isabella Rossi, you are the most brilliant, compassionate, and truly beautiful woman I have ever known. You are not an accessory. You are the entire collection. Will you marry me? Tears finally came, but they were not tears of shame or humiliation. They were tears of overwhelming, unexpected joy. The ice in her chest melted away, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body. Yes, she breathed, a laugh bubbling up through the tears. Damien, yes, of course, yes. Good, he said, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. Now, about your ex-husband. I think it's time he learned a lesson about what true value really means. The morning after the gala, Julian Vance was riding a wave of self-satisfaction. His office at Vance Capital Partners, a sleek, minimalist space overlooking the concrete canyons of Wall Street, felt like a throne room. The story of his toast was already the talk of the town. He'd received half a dozen texts from friends and rivals alike, all variations on the same theme. Ballsy move, Vance. Aria's a stunner. Heard you put on a show last night. He was trending, he was relevant, he was the victor. His fiancée, Aria, had been ecstatic. The photos of her and her ring were splashed across page 6 and every relevant society blog. Her Instagram follower count had jumped by 50,000 overnight. For her, the cruelty of the moment had been entirely eclipsed by the brilliance of the publicity. "You were amazing, darling," she'd purred over breakfast at their penthouse apartment. "So powerful. Everyone is talking about us." "They're talking about a power couple," Julian corrected her, gently sipping his espresso. "That's the brand we're building." His focus today wasn't on social gossip, however. It was on the biggest deal of his career, the acquisition of Innovate Dynamics, a groundbreaking AI logistics company that was poised to revolutionize global shipping. The company was privately held, notoriously picky about its partners, and its reclusive founder had been playing hard to get. But Julian was confident. He'd just secured a final round of funding from a consortium of international investors and was ready to make an offer so aggressive it couldn't be refused. This deal would elevate him from a successful player to a legend. He spent the morning on the phone with his lawyers and his European backers, his voice crisp with authority. Everything was falling into place. He even sent a smug, gloating text to a mutual friend, knowing it would get back to Isabella. "Tell me you saw the pictures from last night. Some things are just an upgrade in every possible way. Hope she's doing okay." He imagined Isabella seeing it, picturing her quiet grief in her lonely brownstone. The thought gave him a little thrill of power. He had moved on to bigger and better things while she was a relic of his past. Around noon, his private line rang. It was Marcus Thorne, his former groomsman. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." "Marcus, good to hear from you. You see the splash we made?" "I did. That's not why I'm calling. I'm hearing some strange chatter about the Innovate deal." Julian's good mood soured slightly. "What kind of chatter? Everything's locked down on my end." "That's the thing. The street says Innovate isn't for sale anymore. At least not to you," Marcus said. "I heard their board had an emergency meeting this morning. Something about a re-evaluation of potential acquirers based on character and long-term vision." Julian scoffed. "Character? This is Wall Street, not Sunday school. They're just posturing to drive up the price. Don't worry about it." "I don't know, man." The word blacklist was used. "It's coming from a solid source." A knot of unease tightened in Julian's stomach. "Blacklist? That's absurd. Who would have that kind of pull?" "No one's saying a name, just that the owner is particular, and he doesn't like loudmouths." Julian ended the call with a curt dismissal, but the confidence he'd felt all morning had begun to fray. He instructed his assistant to get him the CEO of Innovate Dynamics on the phone immediately. An hour passed, then another. His calls weren't being returned. His emails received automated responses. It was like a steel door had slammed shut. Meanwhile, in her quiet gallery, Isabella was having a very different kind of day. She and Damien had decided to keep their engagement private for a little while longer, to savor it for themselves before the inevitable media storm. The sapphire ring sat in its box in her safe, but she could feel its phantom weight on her finger, a secret, happy promise. She was in her office, finalizing the details for a new exhibition, when her phone lit up. It was Damien. "Morning, fiancé," he said. His voice was light, but she could hear an undercurrent of something else, something steely. "Morning, fiancé," she replied, the word tasting wonderful. "Is everything all right in London?" "Everything is perfect. I just had a very interesting conversation with my board," he said. "Specifically, the board of a little logistics company I founded a few years ago. You might have heard of it. Innovate Dynamics." Isabella sat bolt upright. "Wait, you own Innovate Dynamics?" "I'm the sole owner," he confirmed. "I started it as a passion project. It's amusing what can grow when you aren't chasing the spotlight. It seems a man named Julian Vance has been trying very hard to buy it." Isabella was speechless. The sheer cosmic irony of it was breathtaking. Julian's career-defining deal, the one that was meant to cement his legacy, was entirely in the hands of the man he had unwittingly challenged. "He doesn't know you're connected to it, does he?" she asked. "He has no idea," Damien said, and now she could hear the cold satisfaction in his voice. "He also doesn't know that my lead investor in London, the one who just helped me close my current round, was about to back his final offer for the acquisition, was past tense." The pieces clicked into place. Julian thought he had his funding secured. He had no idea the money was ultimately controlled by the same person whose company he was trying to buy, and whose fiancée he had just publicly humiliated. "This morning," Damien continued, "my team received an alert from our media monitoring service. It flagged an article from page 6. It featured a lovely photo of your ex-husband and his companion, and it quoted his toast from last night in its entirety. My board members were not impressed. They felt his brand key, as he calls it, was not aligned with our company's values of discretion and respect." Julian's own words. His own need for public validation was being used as the very weapon to undo him. "So what happens now?" Isabella asked, her heart beating fast. "For now, nothing," Damien said. "We're going to let him sweat. We're going to let him call and email and wonder why the deal of a lifetime just evaporated into thin air. Let him sit in his throne room and realize the walls are starting to close in. Some lessons are best learned in silence." A week passed. For Julian Vance, it was a week of escalating frustration that curdled into raw panic. The silence from Innovate Dynamics was absolute and deafening. His calls went to voicemail. His emails were unanswered. The ironclad deal he had boasted about was now a ghost, a phantom he couldn't grasp. Worse, the whispers on Wall Street had grown into a steady, damning murmur. Rumors circulated that Vance Capital Partners was unstable, that Julian had lost his touch. The European investors, who had been so eager to back him, suddenly became evasive. Their promised capital, the lifeblood of his acquisition plan, was indefinitely delayed pending a market review, a flimsy excuse he knew was a lie. He was being professionally iced out, and he had no idea why or by whom. The pressure began to take its toll on his meticulously crafted life. The penthouse apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. His relationship with Aria, built on the shallow bedrock of mutual vanity, began to show hairline cracks. "Why are you so tense all the time?" she asked one evening, scrolling through her phone. She was lying on a white chaise lounge, perfectly arranged for a selfie. "You're ruining the vibe." "The vibe, Aria," Julian snapped, pacing the length of their floor-to-ceiling windows. The biggest deal of my life is imploding for no reason, and you're worried about the vibe. Well, it's not my fault, she pouted, turning the phone's camera on herself to check her reflection. Maybe you just weren't as good as you thought you were. Did you think about that? The comment, intended to be petulant, struck a raw nerve. It was the one possibility his ego refused to entertain. This is a coordinated attack. He seethed more to himself than to her. Someone is doing this to me. His paranoia grew. He yelled at his assistants, accused his lawyers of incompetence, and saw conspiracy in every delayed response. The confident, charming titan of finance was being replaced by a snarling, desperate man. Arya, who had signed up to be the fiancée of a winner, watched his transformation with growing distaste. The power and success that had attracted her were evaporating, leaving behind only a bitter, angry man. This wasn't part of the brand she wanted for herself. Meanwhile, Isabella's life was moving in the opposite direction. She and Damien had spent the week in a bubble of quiet joy. He had flown back from London, and they spent their evenings not at galas, but cooking together in her cozy kitchen, or taking long walks through Central Park after dark, unrecognized and untroubled. They talked about the future, not about assets and branding, but about values and dreams. He wanted to fund a foundation that would make art accessible to children in underserved communities, an idea born from her own passion. She wanted to travel with him, not to be seen, but to see the world. Their lives were weaving together, creating a tapestry rich with shared meaning and mutual respect. One evening, they were sitting by the fire in her living room when Damien's tablet chimed. He glanced at it, a frown touching his lips. "What is it?" Isabella asked. "It's the quarterly report from my family office," he said. "It lists all my direct and indirect holdings. There's something here I didn't realize." He turned the tablet to show her. It was a complex flowchart of investments and shell corporations. His finger rested on one box. Blackwood Holdings owns a majority stake in a Swiss private equity firm. That firm, in turn, is the primary backer of the European investor consortium that Julian was relying on for his Innovate bid. Isabella stared at the screen. "Oh, so the money he was counting on was your money all along?" "Effectively, yes. He was trying to buy my company with my own capital, and he never even knew it," Damien said, a grim sort of wonder in his voice. The man's arrogance is matched only by his lack of due diligence. This was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just that Damien owned the target company. He controlled the funding to acquire it. He had Julian in a financial pincer movement, and Julian was so blind he couldn't even see the jaws closing in. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Julian had hired a private investigator, an expensive ex-Mossad agent named Zev, to find out who was behind Innovate Dynamics. For days, Zev came up empty. The ownership was buried under layers of impenetrable offshore corporations. But Julian was relentless, paying an exorbitant fee for Zev to dig deeper. Finally, late one Friday afternoon, Julian got the call. "I have a name," Zev said, his voice gravelly. "It cost a fortune to get, and I had to break 3 different kinds of laws, but I have it." "Who is it?" Julian demanded, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. "Who owns Innovate?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. The ultimate beneficiary, at the very top of the food chain, is a man named Damien Blackwood. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Damien Blackwood, the tech billionaire, the recluse. He'd never met the man, but he knew the legend. Blackwood was in a different league entirely. He was old, money, new money, and every kind of money in between. Why would a man like that want to ruin him? They didn't travel in the same circles. They had no history. It made no sense. He hung up the phone, his mind racing. He now had a name for his tormentor, but the motive was a complete mystery. He paced his office, the feeling of powerlessness gnawing at him. He, Julian Vance, who prided himself on knowing everyone and everything, had been blindsided. He looked out the window at the city below, the city he had intended to conquer, and for the first time he felt small and very, very vulnerable. He had no idea the real reason for his downfall was sitting by a fireplace just a few miles uptown, her hand resting gently on the arm of the man who was quietly and systematically dismantling his world. Julian's obsession with Damien Blackwood consumed him. He ordered his team to compile a complete dossier on the man, every known investment, every rumored venture, every charity affiliation. The more he learned, the more insignificant he felt. Blackwood operated on a global scale that made Vance Capital Partners look like a child's lemonade stand. But the central question remained a maddening void. Why? Why would this financial titan target him? He couldn't find a single connection. No rival bids, no crossed paths, no social slights he could recall. He even had Zev the investigator dig into Blackwood's personal life, but the man was a digital phantom. There were no scandalous photos, no bitter exes, no public presence. The man's privacy was a fortress. Julian was fighting a shadow, and it was driving him insane. His deal was dead, his reputation was in tatters, and he was bleeding investors who no longer trusted his judgment. It was on a Tuesday morning, a miserable, rainy day, that matched his mood, that the bomb finally dropped. It didn't come in the form of a market crash or a legal notice. It came on the cover of Prestige, the city's most influential luxury lifestyle magazine, a publication more powerful than the Wall Street Journal for the circles in which Julian desperately wanted to remain. His assistant, a young woman he'd been terrorizing for weeks, placed the magazine on his desk with trembling hands. "Mr. Vance, I think you need to see this." Julian glanced at it dismissively and then froze. The cover was a masterpiece of understated elegance. It was a photograph of two people, not in a studio, but in what looked like a private garden, bathed in soft, natural light. A man with dark hair and a quiet, confident smile had his arm around a woman. The woman was leaning into him, her face alight, with a serene, genuine happiness that Julian had never seen on her before. Her hand rested on his chest, and on her finger, a magnificent twilight blue sapphire seemed to pull all the light in the room toward it. The woman was Isabella. The man was Damien Blackwood. The headline in bold, sophisticated font read, "Silent Power, Damien Blackwood and Isabella Rossi on Love Art and the New Meaning of Success." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. It was as if the world had tilted on its axis. He snatched the magazine, his hands shaking as he flipped to the feature story. The article was a 10-page spread filled with stunning photographs of them at Isabella's gallery in the library of a sprawling country estate that was obviously Damien's, walking hand in hand through a Florentine piazza. The text was even more devastating than the images. It was a glowing profile positioning them as the city's new intellectual and cultural power couple. It detailed Damien's quiet philanthropy, his brilliant business mind, and his deep respect for Isabella's work. It praised Isabella's keen eye for art, her resilience, and her grace. It spoke of her new chapter after a difficult divorce, painting her not as a victim, but as a phoenix who had risen stronger and more brilliant than before. And then there was the quote from Damien. The journalist had asked him what drew him to Isabella. In a world full of people shouting to be noticed, Blackwood was quoted as saying, "She is a person of substance. She doesn't need to be the center of attention because she is her own center. She is an original, not a copy. She is, in a word, flawless." Flawless. The word, his word, the one he had used as a weapon to humiliate her, was now being used to elevate her to a pedestal he could never hope to climb. It was a calculated, devastatingly precise counterstrike. The article went on to announce their engagement, describing the sapphire ring not by its carat weight, but by its history, a rare, ethically sourced stone from a forgotten mine in Sri Lanka. It was a subtle but clear dig at the loud, flashy, and conventional canary diamond he had given Arya. Julian stared at the photograph of them, his mind finally horrifically connecting the dots. Innovate Dynamics, the European investors, the whispers, the blacklist. It wasn't business. It had never been about business. It was personal. Blackwood hadn't attacked him because he was a rival. He had attacked him because he was Isabella's ex-husband. The woman he had discarded and publicly mocked was engaged to the very man who held his entire professional life in the palm of his hand. He let out a strangled, guttural sound, a mixture of a laugh and a sob. He had been playing checkers, moving his pieces with smug arrogance, while Damien Blackwood had been playing a game of three-dimensional chess that had started the moment Julian opened his mouth at that gala. He had thought he was delivering the killing blow, when all he had done was announce his own execution. His office door creaked open. It was Arya. She was holding her own copy of the magazine, her face pale, her professionally applied makeup, unable to hide the shock in her eyes. "Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you see this? Is this real?" Julian looked from the magazine to his fiancée. He saw her not as a trophy anymore, but as a liability, a symbol of his own shallow, catastrophic miscalculation. The beautiful, flawless accessory to his success was now the living embodiment of his failure. "Yes," he said, his voice hollow. "It's real." He watched the calculation in her eyes, the dawning realization that the brand she had attached herself to was now toxic. The power, the money, the status, it was all gone or soon would be. And it had all been taken away by the quiet, unassuming woman he had been so certain he had left in the dust. The fallout from the Prestige article was not a gentle decline. It was an avalanche. Julian's phone, which had been ominously silent for weeks, began to melt down. It was a cacophony of calls from reporters at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and a dozen salivating gossip rags, all clamoring for a comment. His carefully curated image was shattered, replaced by a single humiliating caricature, the arrogant ex-husband, the fool who had thrown away a queen, unaware that a king was waiting in the wings. He was no longer the victor in his own narrative. He was a villainous side character in Isabella's much more compelling one. He retreated to his penthouse, drawing the heavy silk blinds as if to shut out the world, but there was no escaping the truth. He could see it in Arya's eyes. The fawning adoration she once had for him had curdled into a cold, appraising stare. She was looking at him and seeing a bad investment, a stock that had plummeted overnight. "You have to fix this," she demanded, her voice sharp and brittle. She wasn't just scrolling on her phone anymore. She was packing. Not a small overnight bag, but a large Louis Vuitton trunk, its jaws open and hungry for her expensive belongings. "Fix it? How am I supposed to fix it, Arya?" he snarled, pacing the vast living room like a caged animal. "The man is Damien Blackwood. He's a legend. He could buy and sell me 1,000 times over and not even notice the charge on his credit card. That's not my problem, she shot back, throwing a silk dress into the trunk with a violent flick of her wrist. I attached myself to your name, Julian. I put my brand on the line for you. I stood on that stage and smiled while you humiliated your ex-wife, all because you promised me a certain kind of life. Now, your name is mud. You're a laughingstock, which means I'm a laughingstock. So you're just leaving? He asked, a wave of incredulous rage washing over him. After everything, just like that. My mother always told me to cut my losses, she said coolly, not bothering to look at him as she carefully folded a cashmere sweater. This is me cutting my losses. She snapped the trunk shut, the sound echoing the finality of her words. She walked to the marble countertop by the door, picked up the enormous canary diamond ring, and held it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. She let it drop. It skittered across the polished stone with a clatter that sounded obscenely loud in the silent room. You can have this back, she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. It's probably the only valuable asset you have left, and frankly, it's starting to look tacky. She walked out without a backward glance, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the marble floor. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Julian alone in the cavernous apartment with the ghost of his ambition. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of rage, humiliation, and half a bottle of Macallan 25, Julian made his final, most foolish move. He stormed out of his apartment, got in his car, and drove to Isabella's gallery. He had to see her, to confront her, to force her to acknowledge the destruction she had brought upon him. He burst into the gallery, a wild look in his eyes. The space was serene, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He found Isabella in the main exhibition hall, calmly discussing the placement of a new sculpture with her assistant. She looked radiant, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress. She wore an aura of confidence that was more dazzling than any jewel. Isabella, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She turned her expression calm, unsurprised. She dismissed her assistant with a gentle nod. Julian, you shouldn't be here. Shouldn't I? He stalked towards her, his voice rising with every step. You did this, you and him. This was your revenge plot, wasn't it, my deal, my investors? You planned it all, a meticulous little scheme to ruin me. Isabella looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with a profound, weary pity that enraged him further. You give me far too much credit, Julian, and yourself far too little. I didn't have to lift a finger. Don't lie to me, he spat, his face inches from hers. That article, that quote, flawless, he used my own word against me. That was a dagger, and you twisted it. The only thing I'm guilty of, she said, her voice remaining level and strong, is falling in love with a good man who sees me for who I am. The rest, that was all you. You were the one who stood on a stage and announced to the world that a woman's worth is measured by her appearance. You were the one who was so blinded by your own ego that you never bothered to do your research on a $10 billion company. You were so busy building a brand that you forgot to build a character. She took a step closer, and for the first time, he saw not the quiet, accommodating woman he had married, but the powerful, self-possessed woman she had become. He instinctively took a step back. Damien didn't ruin you, Julian. He just held up a mirror and you shattered it. He didn't have to attack you. He just sat back and watched you self-destruct. Your toast at the gala wasn't a shot at me. It was a public confession of your own deep-seated insecurity and superficiality. And in his world, in the world of real power and substance, that's a fatal flaw. You weren't defeated in a hostile takeover. You were simply disqualified from a game you didn't even know you were playing. Every word was the unvarnished truth, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. The rage and scotch couldn't protect him from it. The fire in his chest died out, leaving a vast hollow emptiness. He had built his entire identity on a foundation of perceived success and public approval, and in a matter of weeks, it had all turned to dust. He looked around the gallery at the beautiful, challenging art, at the woman he had so casually and cruelly discarded. He had traded her for a reflection, and the reflection had shattered. He had boasted about his fiancée's fleeting beauty, never realizing his ex-wife possessed a strength and grace that were infinitely more valuable and infinitely more powerful. He started, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say he had lost? Not to her, not to Damien Blackwood, but to himself. You should go, Julian, Isabella said softly, turning her back on him to look at the sculpture. The conversation was over. His part in her life was finally and truly finished. 6 months later, the name Julian Vance was a ghost on Wall Street, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones at exclusive bars. Vance Capital Partners had imploded with spectacular speed, its assets liquidated in a fire sale to cover a mountain of debt. The sleek penthouse, once his monument to success, was sold at a humbling loss. Julian's last public sighting wasn't in the society pages, but in a grainy, candid photo snapped outside a restaurant in Greenwich, Connecticut. He was having lunch with his parents, the famous swagger, replaced by the weary, stooped shoulders of a man crushed by the weight of his own hubris. He stared into his water glass, avoiding the disappointed eyes of his father. He had learned the hardest lesson of all: the view from the top of a molehill is still just a few feet off the ground, and the fall is just as painful. For Isabella and Damien, life had become a masterclass in quiet, deliberate joy. Their wedding was the antithesis of the Starlight Gala. They married on a sun-drenched cliffside terrace in Positano, overlooking the glittering Tyrrhenian Sea. There were no press, no crowds, just 20 of their closest family and friends. Isabella wore a simple, breathtakingly elegant gown by a designer she had helped discover, and she carried a bouquet of olive branches and fragrant white peonies. Damien, in a tailored linen suit, looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. Their vows weren't about mergers or assets. They spoke of shared values, mutual respect, and the promise of a partnership built on truth. The only photographer was Sarah, Isabella's best friend, who captured moments of genuine laughter and stolen kisses, not posed tableaus for a magazine. Their life together became a seamless blend of their passions. The Art Start Foundation was not a vanity project. It was their shared mission. They poured tens of millions into creating state-of-the-art creative centers in public schools across the country. One afternoon, they visited the first completed center in the Bronx. They walked through a sunlit room filled with children painting, sculpting, and composing music on new computers. A young girl with paint-smeared cheeks proudly showed Isabella her vibrant canvas. In that moment, watching the spark of creativity ignite in a child's eyes, Isabella felt a sense of accomplishment more profound than any gallery sale or social triumph. She was no longer defined by the men in her life. She was Isabella Rossi, philanthropist, art expert, and co-architect of a meaningful legacy. One crisp autumn evening, They stood on the terrace of their new home, a stunning, modern house overlooking the Hudson River, far from the city's frantic energy. The architecture was brilliant, but not ostentatious, designed to blend with the natural landscape rather than dominate it. It was a home, not a statement piece. Damien came up behind Isabella, wrapping his arms around her waist as she looked out at the water. The twilight sky was a swirl of purple and orange, a masterpiece no artist could replicate. "What are you thinking about my love?" he asked softly, resting his chin on her shoulder. She was quiet for a moment, watching the lights begin to twinkle on the distant shore. "Do you remember that night, the gala?" "I try not to," he murmured into her hair. "But I will never forget the look in your eyes when I called you on FaceTime. The strength that was holding back so much pain. I felt so small," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "So erased. I think a part of me for 12 years had accepted his definition of value. I thought my worth was tied to his success. When he stood up there and said those things, it was like he was confirming my deepest, darkest fear that I was disposable." "And now," he prompted gently. Isabella turned in his arms to face him, her own eyes clear and bright. She reached up and touched the faint scar above his eyebrow, a gesture of intimate familiarity. "Now I know that my value was never his to define. It was always mine to own. My life with him wasn't a waste. It was a long, difficult, and ultimately necessary education. It taught me the difference between glitter and gold, between noise and substance, between a brand and a soul. In a way, his cruelty was a gift. It broke the last chain and set me free. It led me here, to you." Damien smiled, his eyes full of the same unguarded affection she'd first seen in that photo from Florence. He was a fool, Isabella, a man dying of thirst while standing in a river because he was too captivated by his own reflection to see the life-giving water all around him. He never saw you. He leaned in and kissed her a kiss that was both passionate and peaceful, a testament to the quiet, unshakable world they had built together. It wasn't a life of drama or revenge. It was a life of purpose, partnership, and profound love. They had won, not by defeating an enemy, but by simply choosing to build a better world, one that had no room for the shallow cruelty of men like Julian Vance. The best revenge, they both knew, wasn't a cold dish served in public. It was a warm, beautiful life, lived well authentically and far, far away from the noise. In the end, this was never a story about revenge. It was a story about value. Julian Vance saw value in surfaces, in trophies, in the roar of the crowd. He built a life made of glass and was shocked when it shattered. Isabella, on the other hand, learned to find value in substance, in character, and in the quiet strength of her own heart. She built a life made of stone and created a legacy. Her story is a powerful reminder that true power isn't about who you can step on to get to the top, but about how many people you can lift up once you're there. If you were moved by Isabella's journey to reclaim her own narrative, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a tale of empowerment and sweet, sweet karma. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story of justice, drama, and ultimate triumph. Thank you for watching.